Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Ingrid Robeyns. She is a humanities professor at Utrech University in the Netherlands, author of Limitarianism, The Case Against Extreme Wealth. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Let's start, well, I guess with just sort of the broad strokes. And I don't think this is going to be, these ideas are going to be terribly foreign to our audience, but that they are a ism, I think is interesting to people. But limitarianism, what is that?
So it's the idea, the reason why it's an ism is because I'm a political philosopher, so I work in a field where people talk about things like egalitarianism and other more technical words. And that's why I came up with this word limitarianism. But it basically means just like you have a poverty line where nobody should fall below, there should also be a maximum, a limit where nobody should be above in terms of personal wealth. That is the conclusion I come to when looking at what wealth does and wealth inequality to our societies.
Okay, let's go through that. Let's just start with some statistics as to where we are in terms of this sort of like incredible disparity, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. But this has been something that's been growing, at least in this country, precipitously now for 50 years or so.
Yes.
And
yes.
I don't know within the context of Europe as much. Maybe you can let us know.
Yes, so I actually digged up the statistics from the 2023 Global Wealth Report, which is online, openly available, so anybody can check it. And this is about the distribution of wealth in the US, personal wealth. And the bottom half of the Americans has 3% of all wealth. And the top 1% has 31% of all wealth. And that distribution, I mean, in the US, it is a bit worse than in Europe, but the distribution that the top half has like between 2, 3, 4, 5%, and the top 1% has 30%, and the top 10 tends to have between 60 and 70. That is in all rich countries.
So let's go through, I mean, before we get to sort of like what's a number that we would limit this to and why, let's talk about, you take us through the various sort of like problems that this type of disparity in particular creates. Because I mean, this is it's all about relativity too, right? I mean, if we were to devalue the dollar and all the numbers, all of a sudden we had, everybody was a millionaire, you'd still have this problem because you'd have some trillionaires or something. And
it's true. Yeah. So it's true that it's about inequality and then really inequality about the top, but it's also about a concentration of so much wealth in the 10% and then especially in the 1% that what economists call the opportunity cost of that money, that means the kind of pain it does to people for spending that money is nothing. Like if you have millions and millions, even billions, you can easily give a few millions to a political campaign because really it doesn't make a difference. Whereas if, of course, a country has also a lot of economic inequality, but the country is in general poor, then those who are in the best positions really need that money for material, to improve their material quality of life. And the particular case of the US is that inequality is perhaps not the largest, because if you look at the distribution, Russia actually is the worst case, and on some metrics, South Africa is also very bad. But the US is such a rich country. The average wealth and the median wealth is so high that the disparity that is great in all these countries makes it even more pronounced. And so you asked me about the reasons to be worried about this kind of wealth concentration. Basically, it's of three types. One is it harms society in two ways. One is that it undermines democracy, and the second way is that it's incompatible with ecological sustainability. These are the harms. The second is that it is what we philosophers call morally undeserved. So nobody can really say that due to their own efforts or something that they can really relate to themselves, they can deserve so much wealth. And the third is that even the super...
We're back. Apologies, we had a little internet problem. So, Professor, you were walking us through the concept of that it's not just a question of inequality. It is the extreme concentration of wealth that allows essentially billionaires, 100 millionaires, of having too much of an influence on our democracy and undermining it, B, creating problems environmentally for us because of the nature of their lifestyles. And then you started to talk about how it was morally undeserved in the context of a political philosophy notion. But let's take the first two first. The question of undermining democracy. Walk us through that, if you will.
Yes, sure. So first, I'm hoping we won't have another glitch with the internet. So technology is not perfect. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Democracy. So you have the sphere of money and you have the sphere of democracy. Ideally, you build walls between those two spheres, for example, by having campaign legislation or by having other legal rules that prevent people from using their money to buy so if you have a position of power in the sphere of money, to buy.
We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland. Apologies, we've had some internet issues, but we have on the line Ingrid Robeyns, the author of Limitarianism, The Case Against Extreme Wealth. And so, Professor, you were outlining for us the problems with democracy associated with such a concentration of extreme wealth. You had mentioned at that point, like obviously the influence that individual players can have within the context of particularly our electoral system, which is so contingent upon money.
Yes.
But continue on.
Yeah, so I think ideally we would have walls between the sphere of money and the sphere of politics, such that one can't turn a position of power in the sphere of money or position of privilege, hence being super rich, into a position of power in the sphere of democracy, because that undermines in the sphere of politics, because that undermines the principle of political equality. However, these walls, even when they are strong, like they are in European Union, because we have very, very strict campaign legislation, they are not perfect. And that is because there's campaign legislation that you can regulate, but there's also lobbyists. And lobbyists, the more money you have, the more people you can hire to lobby for you. And for example, in the US, there's a fantastic book written by the American Patriotic Millionaires, which is an activist millionaire group. It's called Tax the Rich, and they have outlined how with lobbying, the super rich have basically decreased the taxes that they pay. So it's logical that if you have money, you can hire lobbyists, you can basically influence politics much more. So this is why I think there is a danger of wealth concentration for our democracies.
I'd like also to add, and I wonder if you have a perspective on this. You know, one of the examples I use, aside obviously from Elon Musk, being able to purchase Twitter, which was presumably the town square, yes. and have a market influence on that town square. But the one example I use is the Gates Foundation. In their essentially completely upending our educational system in this country for about 2 decades because of their ability to dump $1 billion and then have billions of dollars chase it in our education system for an experiment that, again, like I think dramatically set education off on a wrong course, and then only to have the Rand Corporation that they hired to make an assessment to tell them that was a failed experiment. Meanwhile, we lost a generation of teachers to this whole sort of like a corporate education reform movement. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, and if there is an equivalent in Europe to that type of dynamic, because, and we'll get to this in terms of like the types of action. Europe already has a baseline. Many countries, some more than others, already has a baseline of social services which free up people in a way that this country does not.
Yes. Yeah, so I should say that my book has both data on Europe and also on the US. And the arguments that I'm making against wealth concentration hold much more in the U.S. So you see that if I may say so, the harmful influence of money on politics, on the environment, are much worse in the U.S. because wealth concentration is much stronger, but also because the root of all this is what you could call the dominant economic policies of the last 5 decades. We call that neoliberalism, and that has been much stronger in the US than in continental Europe. We still have a bit more of a mixed economy. There's still more government involvement, and that means that certain goods are still provided at decent or high quality by the government, including basic education, including some form of healthcare. That depends a bit, or that differs a bit between countries. And that means we have kept that out of the market. And in a mixed economy, you would give some goods that make up our quality of life to the market, to market players. You should give some to the government to take care of, and some should be common. So people that collectively decide to take care of a certain provision, as we now, for example, see in energy cooperatives. And what I think is a big difference between the US and continental Europe is the degree to which we allow the government to take on some of those roles. If I talk to Europeans, I say it's been going backward for us. We should reclaim the role for the government. But if you compare Europe with the US, it's clear that inequalities are less pronounced and also have less of an effect on the worst off in Europe because of the social security system and the welfare state that is still, even though it's been worsening, it's still stronger than in the US.
Let's speak about how this type of wealth concentration immiserates the poor in this country.
Yes, so actually there is a book being written by the Princeton sociologist Matthew Desmond that who details who describes in quite detail how government policies are actually often pro-rich rather than pro-poor. And he makes a very important point, which is that when it comes to any policies that involve money, including, of course, tax policies, it is a zero-sum game. That means if you cut taxes for the rich, which you can do either because the tax rates go down or because you have different rules for income from labor and income from capital, because the rich people tend to have capital and income from capital, then you favor the rich, which means you're missing out on tax revenue that you could use to invest in education, health, housing, communities for everybody, but especially for the poor. And that is a story that goes a bit against the kind of myth that we have in our current form of capitalism, which is that everybody would become better off from capitalism. I'm not against a form of capitalism, but I think the current form we have is really it's not giving a real, genuine opportunity to, the majority of people, really.
Right. So, I guess that's my question here as well. The notion that is capitalism in general always going to create any unequal outcomes democratically, meaning that when there are people who have higher concentration of wealth or who have more wealth, even when we're severely limiting that kind of system, doesn't that just inherently give the wealthier better opportunities to influence democracy, even if we're beginning to shrink that sphere of influence?
Yes, so I think some of these inequalities will be inevitable if you have some form of free market system. I think that's a price worth paying, but right now they're just too big, and the support for people who do not have that power in society has weakened. And there is another issue which we haven't touched upon yet, which is that because the inheritance tax has either been abolished or is effectively very close to zero in many countries, we're basically letting some people be born purely due to the luck of who their parents happen to be, with millions. They receive millions just because they happen to be the kids of some very rich parents, and others have nothing. And that creates a really big inequality of opportunity. And also, I mean, the people who argue for capitalism and the ideal of the American dream and so forth, they all say, yes, you should have equal opportunities, but we right now do not have equal opportunities. So I think even people who are, say, pro-market and pro-meritocracy, they should favor much higher taxation on inheritance. Actually, some scholars just say we should abolish inheritance, because why should you receive something purely because you happen to have been lucky of where and with whom you were born? So if you were to, for example, if you were to have a full abolishment of inheritance and all that money would be redistributed fairly among all young people, so you don't even need a state. You can distrust the state and keep it out of this redistribution. Then all young people would get a kickstart, a citizen's income or whatever you want to call it, at the beginning of their adult life, and there would be much more equal opportunity and hence much fairer chances than we currently have.
How much? I was just going back to that, keeping the poor living in poverty, as you write. How much of that is, and obviously the dynamics between, let's say, a country, the Netherlands or even Belgium and the United States is very different, because we have control over our currency, and the implications of our currency internationally is a little bit different, because we've shown zero hesitancy to run at a deficit and create debt when it comes to cutting taxes for wealthy or the corporations. Far more reluctant to incur that debt or deficit when it comes to subsidizing good internet connection, or for that matter, or providing support for parents with children, or daycare. I could go on and on and on. Yeah. How much of that dynamic of the failure to collect taxes on wealthy people is inhibiting services for the poor? How much of that dynamic is actually sort of a canard, if you will? Like, we could provide these services for the poor in this country, but the wealthy, by hoarding the money that they're hoarding, create the narrative that there is no money available for these things, more than actually really create the lack of money for these things.
No, totally. I mean, the irony is that the U.S. has more money than almost any other country. We have a few very small countries like Switzerland, also because it really attracts a lot of. It's a taxpayer's paradise. But if you talk about large countries, the U.S. is on average incredibly rich. It's a very rich country. So you could really, as a country, have all those basic investments in education and health and all those other things. But I think the problem really in the U.S. is that politics, the democratic system, has been really captured by big money. I mean, American political scientists no longer talk about democracy. They say of the U.S. that it's an oligarchy. Some say plutocracy. And so that basically means that the democratic system is in the hands of those with lots of money. Now, we've seen that there are a couple of exceptions to that. You have had some members of Congress elected that did it without taking money from Wall Street. But that is, for me, the question. It's like almost like a catch-22. You can't fix the socioeconomic system because what you need is the democratic system, but the democratic system is basically being kept hostage by some players in the socioeconomic system. And the only solution I see is to make people back, to activate them as citizens, so to inform them, to have them engage with the facts. Of course, therefore you also, of course, need neutral media. You need media that report on facts and not on propaganda. So it is a very difficult situation to be in.
We also have the problem where we have a media that is very much tied to wealthy interests, and so is going to be very tough to count on them to present this story on a regular basis, it seems to me. Let's talk about before we get into sort of like the three types of action that we need to change this. You write, you have a chapter entitled "Nobody Deserves to Be a Multimillionaire." This is where we start getting into sort of like the ethical and moral implications of this, where, to be honest with you, I am less comfortable on some level, because I don't really care one way or another about the moral or ethical implications of this generally. It's just incredibly dysfunctional in my estimation, and not the way we should go. But it is something that is deployed when you raise this to people in this country, the idea of a confiscatory tax, that it's like, how could you, on moral grounds? There's no sort of practical argument that they have in, well, there is a practical argument. We can address that in a moment, entrepreneurship and whatnot, and, progress. But what is it about the question of deserve?
Yeah, so this is, I accept this is really an argument for moral philosophy. But the argument is, in moral philosophy, you have theories of desert, and in the idea of meritocracy, the basic moral core is that people deserve a certain amount of wealth or certain material outcomes because of something that has to do with their own personal actions or effort, and here we tend to think that those who are very successful economically, that they have done something that makes them deserving of that economic success. But there is an idea of human nature underlying this type of reasoning, which emphasizes individual properties, our talents and our efforts, and I think it downplays the very large role of luck in our lives. And here I draw on research from various disciplines, but basically there's the natural lottery, the social lottery, and there's also something called market luck. The natural lottery is where you are born with with the kind of genetic makeup you have, the talents you have, but also, for example, whether you're prone to illnesses. Also something like the energy levels that you may have into your body constitutively. Those are just merely things if you happen to be a strong person, you are very lucky. And then I think the right attitude is counting your blessings rather than saying, look, this is me, I deserve everything I can do with this body and these talents that I've received. The social lottery is the parents you got, and here, or the environment. For example, if you're born in the US, you're much more lucky than if you're born in, let's say, Somalia or Afghanistan. There's no we don't need to explain this. So that means that if you are born in a country that offers lots of opportunity, again, the right attitude is to say, well, I've been lucky that I was born here, rather than to believe that whatever people who do not receive any opportunities can make of their lives is their responsibility. So the bottom line is that I think the view of human nature that we should embrace is one that acknowledges the huge influence of luck on our lives. And if we were to take that view of human nature, rather than the one that focuses on individual responsibility and individual merit that is dominant in the neoliberal view of human nature, we would look at the deservingness of our economic success in a different way. That is, I know this is a metaphysically kind of destabilizing or kind of perhaps I would say non-mainstream view that I'm advocating there, but I believe it to be true based on what I know from what I've read in the sciences.
This is, I should say, it's pretty mainstream here, at least on this program, that perspective. But I wonder, too, how much does the vestige of religion work at play here? Because it seems to me that, like, the way that you ignore luck in this instance, which of course is like, again, like you say, function of, in this country, what area code were you born in, who are your parents? Mm-hmm. All of this seems to me to be like, if you ignore the fact that you got lucky, it has to be some semblance of like, I received these skills or whatnot because I was in some respects chosen, or, and I wonder how much of that is a vestige of a sort of a religious rubric, if you will, and why that would be so prominent in the U.S. Versus, let's say, European countries.
So I should say this is not my area of expertise. I don't have any expertise on the effect of religion on wealth distribution. But so I'm just going to say some general things that I believe to be true. But you can correct me if you think I'm wrong. So I think it has to do probably with Protestantism, and that in Europe I guess the type of Protestantism that the way it's been developed might be a bit different than in the U.S. And of course, we also still have half of Europe is Catholic, or we still have other influences too. Of course, you have different types of minority religions, and to the east you have more Orthodox churches. And I think, of course, if you believe that you were chosen by God and that your talents have been given to you, and you have a whole story around this, then there's little I can say to a person who believes that they deserve it in that sense. So it is, I should just say, I think it's just the case that my book is written from a secular perspective, because, and perhaps this is different in Europe than in the US, but I just think we can't think about how we should organize society from a religious perspective, because there are plenty of people who are not religious, and there are also, among those who are religious, there are very different points of view. So, that's the best I can make of it, I fear.
Well, I mean, I just, I look back, and we look back at like sort of the era of monarchs and rulers up until really the advent of democracy, and it was all justified by divine right. And if you were in that position and you had the opportunity to have the biggest army, or your dad was king, and so now you're king, it all is okay and morally justified because that's the way God wanted it. Yeah.
But, I think people who have excessive power will always come up with,
right,
you could say, constructed reasons to justify why they believe they should have that money. So it is, and that's, of course, they would say, suppose they're now trying to justify why they have all those billions. Well, they would probably say, they would start to talk about their own input, their own efforts, their own genius. There are also plenty of super rich people who believe that they are of a different type of special type of human beings who are geniuses. Whereas if you were really to kind of look into detail on how they became so so rich, there's also really this enormous effect of luck. Actually, one of the three types of luck I didn't explain, but market luck is also a form of luck. Robert Frank has written this fantastic little book called Success and Luck. He's an economist, and he explains how even among those who are equally talented and equally able and willing to put in an effort, luck still plays a major role in who will get, say, the dominance of a product in the market or who will be picked as a CEO. And yeah, I think it's eye-opening to see from studies the importance of luck in our lives. Yeah. But of course, if you take a religious view and then just say, luck is what God has given me, then I think I can no longer argue with such a person.
Well, to your point, I mean, I think there's two separate points, right? Where there is, why is there less class consciousness maybe in the United States than there is in other countries? And I would say there's a lot of prosperity gospel kind of ideology, if to Sam's point, where wealth equals moral standing, but that's kind of like just working backwards maybe from the inequality. But to your point, like there's that famous study that was done by UC Irvine of monopoly players, where there is an understanding when they're playing the game Monopoly that they're giving an unfair advantage to one cohort and they end up winning, but they interview them afterwards and they begin to say, well, this is what I did to deserve it. I actually did win fairly. Yeah. And that is, I think, the kind of motif I return to when looking at the psychology of what you're saying.
Yes, yes, you're totally right. Yes, so that is really what people do. We always try to justify the privileges. It's in the end, it's economic privileges that we've had, and then so that we don't have to question whether we should actually keep them.
Yeah.
Let's. I want to talk about the three types of action that you suggest is needed here to deal with this. The first being structural action, the second being fiscal action, and the third being a ethical or cultural change. In terms of structural action, that I guess is basically what we were talking about earlier. To set the table for this, you need to have a stronger welfare state, for lack of a better word, or social insurance program that runs across and decommodifies a lot of the sort of the necessities that we have in the context of modern life.
Yes, that's one important aspect, but it's really, I think the structural changes have really to do with the type of economy that we have. So, and of course, the welfare state, I see the welfare state or insurance, social insurance as part of the economy, because in the end, the economy is a system we have to provide for our material quality of life. At least that's how I, in a sort of a systems neutral way, would describe this. One important thing that empirical scholars have noted is that the share of the economic production that goes to those who are working, hence to the production factor labor, has gone down in comparison with the share that has gone to those who put in capital. And that means that the old categories from political economy, capital and labor, really need to be back on the table. And it is in the end about a division of power, because if capital is stronger, more powerful than labor, then they can dictate the rules of the game. And the problem, which Adam Smith already in the Wealth of Nations pointed out, is that often people who work and who only have their labor to gain an income that they need to feed their families, they must take whatever offer they can get, because those who actually are at the capital side, they have time, they can wait. And to make this story shorter, what you really need is a power balance, and you need a power balance because you need to have a power balance. You need labor unions. And that I see is really a big difference between the US and Europe, that we have legal protection for labor unions. And this is, if you see at what, for example, Bezos and Musk do, it's a problem.
Yeah, and we've definitely seen union density drop dramatically over those 4 or 5 decades in which sort of we entered the neoliberal era, without a doubt. And in some respects, it precipitated it as well. So it's both, and I would imagine both like an increase in the governmental support and structure to make unionization more, make it easier, but also, bringing people to a contract quicker once those unions get established. But I would also imagine that if I did not have to worry about health care, and if I did not have to worry about daycare, and I didn't have to worry about housing, that is going to significantly change the power balance between me and a capitalist manager, because
absolutely,
I could lose my job, but I know that I'm going to be able to provide healthcare for my kid.
Absolutely.
I can lose my job, but I'm not going to lose my home, et cetera, et cetera.
No, absolutely. And there we really see, this is actually also a change we've seen in Europe, including in my own country, that a significant size of the housing has been moved from public housing to a housing market. And the super rich increasingly see housing as a very good investment because it's safe, it's stable, it has a good return. And then, of course, they try to what they always do, to try to maximize the returns, which means they try to maximize the rent they can ask. And that's and then really housing becomes a complete commodity, whereas we should really see housing as something that meets a human right, a basic need. So it is really also something about changing the ways in which we look at some of those things.
Let's talk about fiscal action. You say the tax rate. How would you determine where the cutoff line is? I can, and let's just start with the premise of in 1960, I believe it was, and certainly through the 50s in the post-world era here, that the tax rate, the top marginal tax rate was 90%. 90 cents of every dollar earned above, which I believe at that time was $470,000. And in today's dollars would be somewhere around 3 million. That was the tax rate, I think, more or less at its peak for about 10, 15 years. In the wake of World War II, it's also brought about what was called the Great Compression, where we had the lowest amount of wealth inequality in this country's history, and the biggest expansion of our economy. There was obviously a lot of other things that were going on, and there were also people who were left out of it in this country. But what's the mechanism in which to set the rates, and at which point, we're going to take 100 cents out of every dollar?
Yeah. So I don't think I think 90 may be possible, although economists would say then you're actually what they call at the wrong side of the Laffer curve, so your tax revenue will go down because of incentive effects. But mainstream economists only look at maximizing tax revenue when they think about what they call optimal tax rates. I think we should not just look at revenue, but we should also look at what wealth inequality does to what we discussed earlier, democracy, but also environmental aspects and so on. So it's not just about the tax rate, but it's especially about what you tax. And here we just see that we keep talking about taxing income from, overall income, but mainly income from labor, and we keep capital gains off the hook. And the super rich, they tend not to have an income from labor. They have an income from capital and increases in capital, or from profits. And so that is really where we should have a discussion. And there you see, in all countries, you see that it's really difficult to move that discussion, because there is it really requires people to become more political and more mobilized. And the other problem, of course, is that capital is internationally mobile. We close our borders for human beings who want to move from one country to another. In Europe, we even let them drown in the Mediterranean. I mean, plenty. Every week people drown because we don't want to let Africans enter Europe. But can go wherever it wants. So we really need to regulate the flows of capital, and that requires international cooperation and also the closing of tax havens. So I've had a couple of journalists ask me, if you were the president of the country, what was the first thing you would do? And I said, organize international an international debate among politicians to close tax havens. And it seems like strange, like what does that have to do with limitarianism? But it is the precondition in order to then better tax capital flows and just also find all the money that is hidden right now and doesn't get taxed at all.
Well, what is, and I need to, at the risk of forgetting to push back on the Laffer curve for a moment, but what is the differential in Europe in terms of capital gains versus tax on labor or wages?
So it is still the case that So I should first say each country sets its own tax rates. So that is that differs between countries. Most countries have some form of taxation on the income from capital, not a wealth tax directly, but those tend to be lower than definitely the highest rates on income from labor. So we had, for example, in the Netherlands, under the last government, there was a sort of an audit done on wealth inequality and on how that relates to the tax system. And the people who did that, the economists that did the analysis, found that the very richest, so it's less than 1% of the population, but those that really have the most concentrated wealth holdings, pay fewer taxes. Why? Because, and that is over all countries, they have most of their income from capital gains. So they have capital that generates an income that's taxed at a lower rate, and they're sometimes also able to, game the system, find loopholes, and so on. And in that respect, I think what the American patriotic millionaires are trying to do by really trying to highlight all these loopholes that you can use if you have capital, but that you can't use if you only have labor, is very important.
I have to push back on the Laffer curve citation, because I am unfamiliar with any example where the Laffer curve actually, I imagine if you tax 100% of every dollar that someone makes, you might see people less inclined to work, it seems to me. But short of that, have you ever seen any sort of like data that suggests that Laffer curve is actually anything other than an interesting theory?
But I hope I said this correctly. It's what economists say.
Right.
So there was actually a review also of my book in The Economist last week, and the reviewer just puts this as a fact. But there was also a very long time, there was a so-called fact, which is that when economies develop, inequality goes down. And when I studied economics, admittedly, that was some decades ago, I was also taught that we don't need to really worry about inequality, because when economies develop, inequality goes down. And that was, I think, really the power of Thomas Piketty's work, that he showed that this was merely an assumption. And that is the problem with economics as a discipline, that it has all these so-called laws that really are not always based on empirical research. They just believe it.
I would love to introduce that writer to the state of Kansas and Governor Brownback's experiment with the Laffer curve, and see that writer's reaction to how effective the Laffer curve is. But let's move to the last one, and I guess the other thing too I wanted to say too about when we were just on the capital. What about the notion of and I know this is, we're a little bit off from that, and maybe in terms of like from a practical standpoint, but a wealth tax, because one of the things that I think the wealthy do, and we see it in the context of Elon Musk, right? Like when I say he bought Twitter, I don't mean he bought Twitter with his money. He bought Twitter with other people's money. And having a fortune like this also allows you to borrow money at virtually a 0% interest rate in many instances. And to borrow that money, I can have $1 billion in the bank. And if I keep it in, this bank, I can also turn to this bank and say, I want a $30 million loan, essentially interest free. That $30 million is not considered a income in any way. It's not a capital gains. It's not a wage income. And meanwhile, my $1 billion is sitting in the bank right now getting, I don't know, 3, 4, 5%. Maybe I have it in treasuries. I'm making money on that. I'm going to be able to pay back that $50 million just based upon what my earnings are. And I mean, I guess maybe this constitutes a tax loophole, or I can just wait until I pass away and my estate pays for it. But these are all sort of mechanisms that I guess would fall under that rubric of structural changes in terms of like what we allow banks to do and what kind of line of credit we give, and going after wealth as opposed to revenue.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And here really, I mean, I've tried to make the case for reducing wealth inequality based on arguments from moral philosophy and political philosophy. But I think if some open-minded economists and legal scholars interested in fiscal issues would also lay out all the different ways in which basically the rich get a much better deal from the system than the middle classes or the poor, then you just see how unfair the whole system is. And that's what we, I think, need to, in many different ways, need to get across to the population, because I don't know how else we're ever going to try to address these issues if we don't mobilize the population at large.
You have a concept in the book where you would say, okay, this is what we're going to do from a statutory standpoint. I'm making up numbers off the top of my head now, but you're only allowed to make, let's say, $3 million a year. And that's the limit on it. But ethically, you really should only make $1 million a year. I think ththose numbers are different relative to what you put in, but that's the dynamic. We want to create a culture where you're looked askance a little bit if you're making over $1 million a year, even though we would put the statutory limit, higher than that. What,
exactly?
How do we go about, like, what's the sequencing here? Because I'm curious as to, like, how do you perceive this changed in the early 80s or the late 70s that brought about the situation we have now?
Yes, so that's a great question, because I really think this is the key to understanding what needs to be done now. And here we should look at the work that historians of economic and political thought did by uncovering basically the development of neoliberalism as an ideology and then later as a dominant policy package. So the neoliberal thinkers, they started to work. They started in Austria. They also had a colloquium in Paris before the Second World War. But basically, they kicked off really with an organization called the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947, and they started to spread their thinking, and there they were backed up by a number of think tanks that again were subsidized or funded by very affluent entrepreneurs and people. And it took them, what is important to realize is that it took them a couple of decades in between the first ideas were developed and that they could seize political power. And they did that in the U.S. in the person of Ronald Reagan, who ironically is just came from Hollywood.
Right.
So he was just basically playing a role, and the role, what he had to play, was given to him by the people who wanted to push the neoliberal agenda. And I think that's why I also believe we need many different people who contribute to this ideological turn. That's in the end what we need. My only really, really big worry is, well, first of all, not that in the meantime there's also millions of people suffering because they don't have the basic needs provided that they should have provided by healthcare and education and so on. But also, the problem is that we are transgressing rapidly planetary boundaries. So we don't have like 3-4 decades to make this ideological turn. Somehow we will have to do it quicker. And here I also am just like looking and thinking, okay, how are we going to do this?
What was the sequencing? Was there a cultural change first? Was there an ethical change first, or was there a structural ideological change that happened in government?
I am not 100% sure, but what I am sure of is that there were first the ideas, then the ideas started to spread, then the ideas started to influence policymakers, politicians, and so on. So basically, you buy your way, or you find your way with these ideas into the system, and the system is then the government and companies and so forth. I think so. It's difficult to say whether how that would now work, because I mean, if you look at people who are young now, they are brought up with those ideas about competitiveness, about desert, about meritocracy. They just think this is what it is. They've forgotten about other reasons. One may be motivated intrinsic reasons, or they may see some things as inevitable or normal only because they've grown up in this system. And that is really a question how to turn that. But I think so structures and individuals, I would just say everybody should try to do whatever they can to turn that tide. I don't think it's one or the other, and I also don't think we have the luxury to choose between those two scenarios.
Ingrid Robeyns, humanities professor at Utrech University in the Netherlands, author of Limitarianism, The Case Against Extreme Wealth. We will put a link to that book at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.